It's worth mentally bookmarking the island as we see it here, because even though this is only an approximation of the pre-1883 Krakatau, it's the last time we'll see this gem of the Sunda Strait looking so verdant. Volcanoes are one of the ways the Earth reconciles its inner conflicts, and unfortunately, in a major eruption, the first thing to go will be the window dressing. The eruption cycle was thought to have started somewhere on the flanks of Purwotan. The first witnesses to Krakatau's opening salvo were aboard the German warship Elisabeth, heading home via Anya. 31 kilometers after passing Krakatau, a huge cloud was observed rising 10 or 11,000 meters into the air before flattening out like a giant thundercloud. For a couple of 100 kilometers, the Elisabeth was coated in fine ash borne on the southeasterly winds that followed it. Other ships recorded a heavy sea swell and a peculiar light green tint in the sky, and loud explosions were heard every few minutes all over the region, including later in the morning at Batavia. Even though this eruption was nearly a century and a half ago, Indonesia's volcanoes have something important to say about modern communications and how we perceive events. In April 1815, in the closing months of the Napoleonic Wars, and 68 years before Krakatau, Mount Tambora, another Indonesian volcano down on Sumbawa, had broken loose with much greater force and at least as many fatalities. At the time Tambora erupted, there was no instant mass communication. By 1883, though, the telegraph network was well established, and what a difference it made. The word about Krakatau was quickly disseminated to news outlets all over the world, making it the first globally shared natural disaster. Tambora's 1815 event scored 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. That's a supercolossal eruption. Krakatau was rated a 6, which is 10 times less productive. But that didn't matter. A new age had dawned, and public perception was now king. The year after Tambora's massive eruption had seen a non-existent summer, accompanied by crop failures and famines, mostly in Europe and North America. The situation was largely down to Tambora's emissions, but had been exacerbated by a spate of other volcanic eruptions in the 1810s and the lingering effects of the so-called Little Ice Age. The 19th century was a period of burgeoning scientific curiosity, so by the time Krakatau's turn came, there was understandable interest in studying what major volcanic events could do to the atmosphere and, by extension, the global economy. This curiosity, coupled with a desire to know exactly what was happening on Krakatau and an incomplete understanding of the dangers, may explain some of the risks that were taken in approaching the newly erupting island. More of that in a bit. Krakatau's eruption cycle lasted from late May to nearly the end of August. Once it was realized that this supposedly extinct volcano was the source of the disturbance, there was a flurry of concern. On Monday the 21st of May, 8 fishermen from Sabisi had visited Krakatau just as things were getting going. They made their way to Katimbang and reported to Willem Beirink, the Dutch controller of the town, that they'd seen the beach erupting. This was pooh-poohed by Beirink's wife Joanna, who insisted that no eruption would start on the beach. Just an hour later, Willem Beirink was joined by his superior, a Mr. Altair, controller of Lampong district, who brought orders from the Governor-General to investigate. Altair and Beirink took a launch across to Krakatau, a 4-hour trip across choppy seas. Nearer the island they encountered pumice rafts, ash falls, and charred tree trunks floating in the water. Closer to Krakatau, they were alarmed to find that the fisherman's account was accurate. The beach did seem to be erupting and wasn't safe to land on at all. Joanna Beering would go on to write a very comprehensive account of her family's battle for survival in the hellish conditions of late August that year, an account that sadly would include the loss of her youngest child. It remains one of the starkest personal descriptions of what living through this eruption was like. The initial phase on the 20th of May was very strong from 6 in the morning to about 10, and was logged by 6 ships passing at different distances from Krakatau. Their reports included ash and pumice landing on deck, thick black clouds surrounding and towering above the island, and tainted skies and sunlight. Once it started, Krakatau kept going. On the second day, the coastal settlements of Anya, Telok Betong, Ketimbang, and the lighthouse at Flakahurk recorded ashfalls and floating pumice. Various locations also reported chains of fire issuing from Krakatau. On the 27th of May, a week after the eruption began, a party of fare-paying passengers from Batavia was taken across to the island aboard the Governor-General Laudon, a steamer whose exploits during the climax of the eruption would become the stuff of legend. This group was led by Schurman, a Dutch mining engineer. There was also a photographer by the name of Hamburg, who took some now famous pictures of the early part of the eruption. These images ended up being pretty much the only ones taken during the eruption of 1883, and were caught as the party sailed toward the island. This wasn't some little band of scientists, although science was definitely part of the reason for the trip. It was a great crowd of no fewer than 86 people who left Batavia at 5 in the evening of the 26th, arriving right alongside Krakatau the next morning. There the Laudon stayed until the Sunday evening, whereupon it steamed back to Batavia, arriving on the morning of the 28th. This was an unbelievably risky thing to do, but they didn't know then what we do now about volcanoes. The obvious strength of the eruption notwithstanding, the group landed somewhere on Krakatau's northern coast and went for a good look around. Some of them made their way right up to the lip of Perbuatan and took measurements. The idea of not only passing right alongside an erupting volcano, but actually going ashore and exploring it, is mind-boggling. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, so they say. But looking at Hamburg's foreboding images, I don't think I would have stopped for a picnic on Krakatau. The visitors were able to see some of what was going on, but were very lucky not to have been poisoned by volcanic gases or roasted by a pyroclastic cloud. Amazingly, there were no reported casualties during this trip. The landing party estimated the crater to be no less than 980 meters across, with a vent a couple of hundred meters in diameter, spewing smoke and ash from an opening at one edge. The noise of this frantically erupting gas and smoke was described as frightening as it shot 2,000 to 3,000 meters upwards, evidently under colossal pressure. We can't know when this very wide crater was formed, as it would disappear forever in just a few more weeks. If it had been formed pre-1883, then it would have occupied an area about the size of this red circle on our miniature. the group found that great swathes of the island were covered in pale ash of about 60 centimetres deep, overlaid in some places onto 30 centimetres of pumice. Thousands of trees had also been stripped of leaves and bark and snapped off at the trunk. The neighbouring island of Verlaten was similarly covered, with its trees denuded of all leaves. If we look again really closely at this photo of Perbuatan venting, we can see hundreds of bare tree trunks on the edge of the island. It's an eerie reminder of what was being unleashed here. In a 1992 paper entitled Krakatau Revisited, Steve Self notes that the intensity of activity before the paroxysmal phase in August may have been underestimated. This could be a further explanation for the lack of caution in approaching the volcano as it got going. After the excitement of that first week, there are very few details of what happened next until mid-June. The volcano continued erupting, but human curiosity in it seemed to die down. We can only speculate, but perhaps this lack of records after a well-documented week of activity indicates that maybe they thought it was all over. Next time, we'll be looking at what the summer that year had in store for the communities surrounding the Sunda Strait. 10 more weeks of loud explosions, apocalyptic gloom, and increasingly troubled seas.